Imagine, if you will, a podcast journeying beyond that which is known to man. It exists in both fandom and discovery, in viewing and critiquing. My name is Matt Hurt. Welcome to Anthology. Hello, and welcome to Episode 2 of Anthology, a podcast exploring science fiction storytelling in television's golden age, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. This episode of Anthology is going to cover Episodes 3 and 4 of The Twilight Zone, both from 1959, Mr. Denton on Doomsday, and The 16-Millimeter Shrine. It's a very good episode. Both episodes have some interesting correlation to one another, some things, some commonality between them that's interesting, and it'll give some good discussion for me to go over. Before I get to the episode, I just want to let you guys know that you can find me on Twitter at ObsessiveViewer, and also go to the Facebook page for Anthology and click like, tell your friends, all that stuff. It's at facebook.com/anthologypod. And of course, and this is probably the most important aspect of the show, or what I hope will be the most important aspect of the show, leave me a voicemail. Call me up and let me know what you think of the show. Let me know what you think of the Twilight Zone episodes coming up. Give your take on it so I can kind of have a sounding board to go off of for episodes to come. You can do that by calling 317-762-6099. Just leave a voicemail. Tell me what your name is, where you're from, and anything you want me to cover, and I'll be glad to play the voicemail on the episode, so it's not just me talking to you for an hour. So without further ado, let's get to the episode discussions. So the first episode I'll be covering this week is Mr. Denton on Doomsday. This was the 5th episode of The Twilight Zone, produced and the 3rd one to air. It was aired on October 16th, 1959, and as usual, I'll go through a plot summary and then a breakdown of the cast, and then get into my feelings on the episode. As always, this episode summary will have spoilers in it, so fair warning. In the Old West, Al Denton was once a feared gunslinger. Now, however, he's the town drunk, forced to sing for his drinks. When a man named Henry Fate comes into town to peddle his goods, a glance at Denton's hand gives the drunk the ability to disarm a bully and win back the town's respect. That respect attracts a young hotshot who challenges Denton to a duel. Desperate to win, Denton buys a potion from Fate that promises to give the drunk 10 seconds of deadly accuracy. When he confronts the hotshot for the duel, however, he sees the young man taking the same potion. What follows is a showdown in which both men manage to disarm each other and inflicting injuries on each other that will prevent them from ever handling a gun again. So I'll talk about how I feel about the episode in a bit, but I want to talk about the cast. The titular character, Al Denton, is played by Dan Duryea. I don't know how to pronounce that. Dan Duryea. I'll go with that. He was a Cornell graduate, and he actually played Hank Hanneman in 1942's The Pride of the Yankees, a movie that I haven't seen yet, although it's on my radar. I actually just recently listened to an episode of Movie Madness podcast, and they did an episode about baseball movies, which we actually also did an episode about baseball movies on the Obsessive Viewer recently, and they talked up The Pride of the Yankees and made me really want to see it, so I'll go back and check that out. But Dan Duryea, he was also in... It's worth noting he was also in Battle Hymn, the 1957 Rock Hudson movie that actually, the poster of which was what triggered Mike Ferris's memory of being in the Air Force in the Twilight Zone pilot episode, Where Is Everybody? Purely coincidental. I don't think that they cast Duryea in the role as a callback or anything like that, but I thought that was an interesting little piece of trivia. He also appeared in The Flight of the Phoenix in 1965, opposite Jimmy Stewart, Ernest Borgnine, and Richard Attenborough. Probably his most notable role was in 60 episodes of the 1960s primetime soap Peyton Place. He eventually died in 1968 at the age of 61. So he had a pretty memorable career in terms of some of the performances he gave throughout the career. Playing Henry J. Fate is Malcolm Atterbury. He'll appear in another episode of the Twilight Zone later in the series, but he was most notably a supporting actor. He had a lot of TV credits. He made his big screen debut in 1958's Dragnet movie, and he also appeared in Hitchcock's The Birds as Deputy Al Malone. But he was never really a star. He was just a supporting actor, which is a very admirable profession. I don't know anything about him as a person, but I have to say that as far as I've read about Malcolm Atterbury, I can't help but just admire his life. He was born into a wealthy family and pursued acting, and he went into theater, and he cultivated this reputation as a solid and reliable stage actor, and then he jumped on to supporting roles in movies and TV. But he still had a deep-seated love of theater. He ended up actually owning 2 theaters in upstate New York that he interacted with and managed and everything throughout his career, while also doing supporting roles in movies and TV. And he died of old age in 1992. You can't really like the idea of someone following their passion to that extent and kind of keeping it humbled, I guess, is something that's really aspirational to me, at least. Who knows? He could have been a dick. I don't know. The last actor I want to point out is Martin Landau is in this episode as Dan Hoteling. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but as Dan, he's the bully that antagonizes Denton in the first couple acts of the episode. And Martin Landau, I mean, he's noticeable. He's notable from several different roles. He's a very famous character actor, but I know him best from The Majestic as Harry Trimble, the father who mistakes Jim Carrey's character as his son, who died in World War II. That role in particular is just very touching to me, and it resonates with me because he gives this nice monologue about how the Majestic, the town movie theater that he runs, is like what that theater represents to the community. And it's something that the way that he delivers that line, he delivers it with so much passion that it really speaks to me. Aside from that, though, Martin Landau also appeared in 2 episodes of The Twilight Zone and 2 episodes of The Outer Limits, so his name will be popping up throughout the course of anthology here. Most notable role for him, his gain to fame was from the Mission Impossible television series, in which he actually appeared in 76 episodes total. Let's see. And then writing this episode was Rod Serling, which, wow, did I seriously just say Sterling again? Holy crap. Wow. Writing this episode was Rod Serling. Again, he wrote a vast majority of the season 1 episodes and season 2 and onward, actually, up until season 4 when he actually left the show. But, Serling's original concept for this episode involved a school teacher magically getting his wish to become a gunfighter. He opted for something less superficial, and I think that was the right course of action, because I'll touch on this when I get to the feelings as a viewer, but there's a very, at its core, Mr. Denton on Doomsday is about a guy getting a second chance, and I don't see how the story of a school teacher magically getting a wish to become a gunfighter, that's more wish fulfillment, and obviously wish fulfillment, but it's more fantasizing, and it's not. I appreciate the tone of the final product, which is why Rod Serling didn't go with that episode plot. Also, it's worth noting, directed by Alan Reisner. He also directed the Time Element, which, as I've said before, is the precursor to the Twilight Zone. It was going to be his. It was basically the script that Serling sold to CBS under the title The Twilight Zone. And then eventually it's the production that got CBS interested in ordering the series for the Twilight Zone. But more on that later. As I said, I'll cover that in a bonus episode at the end of this season. So my feelings as a viewer on this episode, it's kind of a mixed bag, honestly. I really like the second chance theme. It's a very kind of heartwarming story because you kind of immediately get behind Al Denton as a protagonist, even though he is a very down on his luck guy he's almost overly sympathetic because he's being just bullied by these nefarious types who are forcing him to sing and dance just so he can get a drink. And it's a tragic viewpoint, and it's a very, very, it's sympathetic to a fault. It's potentially too just overly sympathetic, and honestly, it makes Al Denton look really pathetic, and there's certain degrees of patheticness that an audience can get behind, but this runs the course of being just way too pathetic. But it's handled well. The acting is well done. Aside from the theme, I like the Western setting, and I like the music. There's this kind of little melody that plays throughout it that's kind of this... It's almost... I don't know much about music, admittedly, but it's kind of it's not quite what you would expect from a Western setting, and it's not quite what you'd expect from such a almost depressing kind of character study, I guess. But it's kind of this nice little, kind of almost upbeat melody that kind of plays out. That's kind of, I don't know, I really got into it. And also I like the supernatural element. Henry Fate is this mysterious character who can influence events around him just by looking at something, and that's something I kind of got into because, the last couple episodes, or the first two episodes, have been kind of rooted in realism to an extent. The character of Death in One for the Angels was a bit supernatural, but it was also kind of his depiction. The depiction of death is something that's tied to humans' understanding or interpretation of what life is. So it's kind of having this other character in this episode be a supernatural entity to an extent, or having some kind of superpowers is different from that, in that it's undefined. And it's something that I got into. I actually dug it a little bit. But like I said, this was a mixed bag. Even though those four or five elements kind of fuse together, separately, those elements are good, and I really enjoyed them as aspects of an episode of television. Something about them all together just lacked a punch for me. This episode's well written, and the story reaches a satisfying conclusion, but honestly, it just feels like it's on rails. There's a story that Serling wanted to tell, and he hits its beats, and then it's done. It's kind of not so much that it lacks the signature Twilight Zone twist at the end, because, it does and it doesn't, because, I wasn't expecting them to injure each other and prevent them, but even then, if it did have just a traditional twist, that would have hampered it for me, because the story being told is about Denton reclaiming his life and about his counterpart in the final duel being incapacitated, and the idea that Denton has saved this kid's life, or at least prolonged it by taking away his ability to fire a gun for the rest of his life. So that interchangeability, that kind of dual character fate was really handled well and everything. It's just something about it just felt just strange to me. I like the supernatural aspect, like I said, but the superpower / science fiction aspect of Henry Fate is handled well. It's interesting, it's intriguing, it's entertaining, but we don't really have any context for who or what he is. I mean, is he a guardian angel, or is the name Fate, is that a little on the nose, and is he supposed to be the personification of fate itself? It's up in the air, which I don't mind ambiguity, but like, okay. The Twilight Zone, by definition, the reason that the Twilight Zone is handled so well, is so well received, is that it pits ordinary people into, for lack of a better word, the Twilight Zone. The world in the Twilight Zone, the world in these episodes is the Twilight Zone. That's what they call it. But the world in this episode is a wholly regular Old West setting. And so there isn't really, the only Twilight Zone aspect of it is Henry Fate himself, which, as I said before, we're not giving any context for who or what he is or what he's hoping to accomplish. I assume that he's a do-gooder and everything like that, but it's more he exists as a vessel to give Al Denton his second chance, which is fine, but I just kind of would have liked a little bit more clarity on what it all meant, at least from his perspective, I guess. Like I said, I didn't dislike the episode. In fact, for all intents and purposes, I really liked the story of Denton's second chance, and I really, really liked the resolution of the episode and how it followed the theme of second chance and picking yourself back up, I guess. It followed that really well. It ends on the way it ends on the note that neither man will fire a gun again. It's really nice. It's a good story. It's a good story, but it just didn't really affect me that much. Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't a bad episode, but I don't know if I really have anything else to really say about it, honestly. There's a really interesting point, though, after Fate has intervened and defeated the bully on Denton's behalf. There's a really good scene because it's when he's earned the respect of the town and everyone respects him again. And there's a really nice moment where someone refers to him as Mr. Denton, and he's just like, what? Like, you're like, he's astonished that people refer to him as anything but anything with any kind of officiality or respect, honestly. But there's a really nice moment between him and Liz, played by Jeannie Cooper, who's kind of, I don't think she'd really be his love interest in the episode, but she's the female lead in the episode. But there's a really nice moment between Denton and her where after he's won the respect of everything, he's worried, he's freaking out. And the reason that he's freaking out is because he knows that now that he's a gunfighter again, or now that he has the reputation of a gunfighter again, people are going to come and want to challenge him. And he sees it as he's just signed his own death warrant. He's going to die. And it's a really not unlike last episode with One for the Angels with a protagonist dealing with mortality and everything. This is kind of the same way, but it's more hurried, it's more rushed, it's more dramatic, and less like introspective. But that one little scene is really opens a window to the Denton character. Yeah, like I said, I don't know. It didn't blow away the other two episodes. It isn't a better episode for me than One for the Angels or Where Is Everybody? But I enjoyed it. It just didn't really do it for me. So I don't know. Your mileage may vary. Contact me and let me know what you thought of the episode, though. I'd love to hear from you. as far as historical and cultural context for the episode, I actually have something for this one. It's worth noting, in the context of the late 50s and early 60s, and in context of television of that era, it's really no surprise that the Twilight Zone had an episode that was set in the Old West, especially so soon in its run. I don't know if this was a calculated move by Serling or just indicative of the times, but Western shows were insanely popular at the time. Though Bonanza had premiered only a month before the Twilight Zone aired and wouldn't even become a hit until 1961, Gunsmoke was 4 years into what would be a 20-year, 635-episode run. And if I can go back a little bit in the chronology, I guess, Gunsmoke premiered, and this is a bit of a tangent, but Gunsmoke premiered in 1955, 4 years before the Twilight Zone, and both that same year, Gunsmoke and The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp were aired. And those two shows really helped usher in an era where Westerns all but dominated television. And the Twilight Zone just happened to premiere when Western TV shows were at their absolute peak. In 1959, when the Twilight Zone premiered, in that year, primetime television was airing 26 Westerns. And this is in the 50s. This is when there's like not much on TV. So it's something that's kind of astonishing. So now that we have that in context, I'm not saying that Serling wrote Mr. Denton on Doomsday with the intention of attracting fans of the Western genre to his little sci-fi anthology series. Sci-fi at the time was actually viewed as a very low form of storytelling. There's an interview with Mike Wallace that Serling did on September 22nd, 1959. He actually goes into censorship and stuff like that. I think I'm actually going to rip the audio and release it as a standalone episode, probably in the interim between season 1 and season 2 of this podcast. But this interview took place a little over a week and a half before Where Is Everybody was aired, and in it, if you look up the YouTube video, it's about 10 or 11 minutes into the interview. Wallace actually said he asked Serling. He said, You're going to be obviously working so hard on the Twilight Zone that in essence, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, you've given up on writing anything important for television, right? End quote. Yeah, so I think that kind of puts that kind of opens a little bit of a window for us to see contextually where science fiction was at the time. Science fiction theater was airing episodes. Actually, at this point, it was off the air now that I think about it. So science fiction was on television. Science fiction theater aired from 1955 to 1957, I believe, airing like 79 episodes, I think. And so I mean, science fiction was on television and was a part of it, but it was so just under the radar, just low on the totem pole of storytelling, that it was just a natural thing for Mike Wallace to just basically say something almost derogatory about the genre and insulting to Serling. I don't know if he took it personally or not, but it was an interesting soundbite for sure, and a very funny look back at how no one saw Twilight Zone coming, in terms of its stature and its quality, really. But to get back to Mr. Denton on Doomsday, all of that is not to say that the Western setting was anything to do with my kind of lukewarm reception to the episode. Whether conscious or not, it's interesting to see such an early episode of The Twilight Zone play so much into what was popular at the time on television. But I don't believe that Serling wrote it with the intention of getting viewers. And if he did, I think that quality of his output of content, because like I said in the last episode, he was just a machine. Like, he wrote and wrote and wrote. I think part of that was that he had so much built up in his, for lack of a better word, in his soul, from experiencing war and just seeing just atrocities and everything. He had so much built up that he needed a release. Like, in the Twilight Zone was the way that he released his creativity and his demons, really. So having said that, I don't think that if he were to write this episode with the intention of getting ratings and stuff, I don't think that it would have tarnished the quality of it. I just don't think that I was really the viewer for it. And that's a little harsh to say anyway, because it's not like I've been saying, it's not like I didn't like the episode. It just wasn't really my thing, I guess. Yeah. So, like I said, let me know what you thought. Please try to put this episode into context for me, or if you have a way to try to persuade me into liking this episode more, feel free to let me know, and I'll reconsider it. I'll look at it again through a different perspective. Yeah, so that does it for the first episode of this episode of Anthology. As always, before I move on to the next episode, here's a highlight from a recent episode of The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast that I host with my friends Mike and Tiny over at obsessiveviewer.com.
The movie was fairly bloated, like a lot of movies tend to be anymore. I think the movie's really this is really just a symptom of, you know, when they try to reboot these franchises like this, or make a fourth installment of something, it's like you have to cram so many things into it, because people have been desensitized to all the majesty and the fun stuff that was in the first 1 or 2 or 3 or 8 movies, and so you have to up the ante, and when you do that, it just becomes bloated, and things fall by the wayside, and it's unfortunate. And I think this movie fell victim to that, unfortunately.
Of course, you can find The Obsessive Viewer on iTunes, Stitcher, and at obsessiveviewer.com. And that brings me to the next episode of this episode of Anthology, The 16-Millimeter Shrine. It aired on October 23rd, 1959, and here's a summary of the episode. Barbara Jean Trenton is an actress whose star has faded. She lives in the past by constantly rewatching her old movies in a dark, private screening room. When her concerned agent arranges a new role in a film for her, she expects a leading role. However, reality hits her in the face when she finds out it's a bit part as a mother. This drives her further into her seclusion. When the agent brings her former leading man for a visit to cheer her up and to get her out of her self-induced isolation, the sight of the aged man before her pushes her over the edge. She then recedes into the screening room, and the next time she's seen, it's in the screen. Barbara is transported into the screen, into a world where she's admired and respected by her youthful co-stars. All right, so I'll start with a rundown of the talent, as usual. Ida Lupina starred in this episode as Barbara Jean Trenton. She was an actress known for her hard luck dame roles in movies like High Sierra and Seawolf, both from 1941. When roles became harder to come by, she turned to directing, writing, and producing, and she actually became a pioneer for women filmmakers, and she was actually the second woman to be admitted into the Directors Guild. When it comes to the Twilight Zone, she's the only person in the series' entire history to appear in and direct episodes of the show. After the 16-Millimeter Shrine, she would go on to direct Season 5's The Masks in 1964. She also holds the distinction of being the only woman to direct an episode of The Twilight Zone, kind of a reflection of the time, I guess. Co-starring as Danny Weiss is Martin Balsam. I know him as Arbogast from Hitchcock's Psycho, and he also had a role in 12 Angry Men. Both just insanely amazing movies. He trained at the Actors Studio after serving in World War II, and he kind of had a few minor television roles before his big break in On the Waterfront in 1954. His big screen break. That was his big screen debut. He was also in an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which is what actually got him cast as Arbogast in Psycho, which was a role that people knew him for throughout his entire life. There was actually a story where he would get angry when people would reference the scene where he falls backwards on the staircase in Psycho, because he wanted to be known for other things, other roles. But his feelings about the role or the reception to the role, I guess, aside, Psycho actually opened a lot of doors. After that, he was in Breakfast at Tiffany's and Cape Fear. He went on to eventually win a Best Supporting Actor Oscar in 1965 for a role in 1,000 Clowns, movie I haven't seen, but he was pretty proud of that, I guess. After that, he started acting in European movies and kind of fell in love with Italy. And he spent his later years in Italy, where he died of a heart attack in 1996. So he had a really good career, much like Ida Lupino. It's also worth mentioning that Martin Balsam, if you read his trivia or his biography on IMDb, it's clearly written by someone who really cared about him. Because it's really, really passionate. It's really nice. Writer for this episode is, once again, Rod Serling, of course. I actually wonder how much of this script came from Serling's personal experiences. He was injured in the war and witnessed horrific things while overseas. And he suffered from flashbacks and nightmares. He actually channeled a lot of those feelings and emotions into his writing. That's why he had such a big output of content from for writing, because he just tapped into his demons and stuff. There's a monologue in the episode where Barbara talks about disappearing into the past when the present is too much to bear, and I kind of wonder if this is a thought that Serling had during the war, and if this was kind of a comfort for him. It might be a stretch, but that was what I thought when watching this episode. And director for this episode is Mitchell Lyson. He directed 3 episodes, all from season 1. This was the first one to air, but it was the last in the production order. He was nominated for an Oscar for 1929's Dynamite movie for Best Art Direction, which is worth noting. And this particular episode, the 16-millimeter Shrine, it looks just stunning. Like, it looks absolutely beautiful. The contrast in the lighting between the viewing room and the foyer set just perfectly defines the seclusion that Barbara is in, and kind of instantly pits the viewer into this somewhat surreal world where she's defiant of change and ignorant willfully ignorant of the present. And it's kind of this very, very clearly defined dichotomy between a very dark and lonely screening room, and then this very brightly lit and just absolutely beautiful foyer set. And a lot of that is probably can probably be credited to George T. Clemens, who was the director of photography on the episode. And this episode, on Netflix has the whole series except for season 4 streaming, and it's in HD. And this episode really, really makes me want to buy the complete series Blu-ray set. I'm gonna buy it eventually. Like I said, I'm committing an entire podcast to it, so I need to own the Blu-ray set. But it's just a problem of funds. So hey, if you want to, submit or donate some money to Anthology, I'll buy the Blu-ray set with it, which would in turn, increase the quality of the show. I'm sure, probably. But anyway, so the other side of this episode being just absolutely stunning, and when I say stunning, I mean just it's in HD and it's clearly remastered and everything. But what you have on the screen is, like I said before, the contrast between the dark room and the rest of the sets of the episode. But there's also footage on the projector, projected on the screen, that comes across it comes across as so crisp and clear, and it's kind of deep in this dark room, and I don't know. It's just something that really, really just looked just beautiful. And this episode really, really makes me nervous for when I eventually get to the 6 episodes in season 2 that were shot on tape as a cost-cutting measure by CBS. So let's get into my feelings as a viewer on this episode. This is a very dark story. Barbara is a prisoner to herself. She's willingly secluding herself as a way to shield herself from the world in her age. She's not even really that old. It's actually an interesting tie back, I guess, to Ida Lupino's personal life. She had trouble getting roles because they were being sought after. She reached a point in her career where the roles that she was wanting and that she was known for were going to the younger actresses, so that's why she turned to directing and writing and producing and all that. So I kind of wonder if her casting was if that was the reason for her casting in this episode. I couldn't find anything to really corroborate that, but there's an interesting correlation between the actress and the character she played on screen. But this episode is just really just downright depressing. There's another interesting correlation between Barbara as a character and Al Denton from the previous episode. Barbara was a notable and talented person. She was successful, much like Denton was as a gunslinger. But now her time has passed and she's in a bad spot. The difference is that while Denton runs the risk of being pathetic and kind of he's kind of a low. He's viewed as pathetic, whether the viewer kind of sides with that analysis or not. But Barbara is more grounded, and her problems are a lot more relatable. She's viewed as being down on her luck and being kind of over the hill. As her agent, who's her greatest confidant in this episode, actually said to the studio executive after he went off on her. But the difference, there's a relatability to it. And if viewers can't relate to the growing older and losing your youth and missing opportunities because of your age or anything like that, then if they can't relate to that, then the self-imposed isolation is something that we could probably all relate to. At least I hope so. She's shielding herself from the world, and she's unwilling to confront her problems. Who doesn't really feel that way sometimes? I mean, sometimes you just want to kind of sit in a room and watch TV all day. You don't want to do anything. You don't want to socialize. You don't want to go out and do anything. At least that's how I feel sometimes. Hell, I'm recording this in my apartment after spending the night just watching the Twilight Zone and Seinfeld, and just because I didn't feel like going out and doing anything. So that's something that we can all kind of really latch onto in this episode, and that's the universality aspect of it that is so what the Twilight Zone is known for. And also, personally, I can relate to it because she's obsessively viewing something, and I created a blog and 2 podcasts about how I am an obsessive viewer. But that's neither here nor there. The performances. I really, really want to highlight the performances in this episode because they are incredibly strong. Martin Balsam and Ida Lupino, they both they tap into the emotions of their characters so incredibly well, and they manage to display more range in this episode than you would ever expect to come from a half-hour TV show, especially from the 1950s, when, as I said before, this particular genre, this show was just airing. Like, this was before. This was the 4th episode to air, and it was before they really had a handle of how successful this was. It was produced later than before anyone knew what the Twilight Zone was, and they put in just such strong performances, and their performances are just absolutely, honestly, they're cinematic in scope, and they're grounded in such incredible believability. I mean, you really believe that Danny, the agent, played by Martin Balsam, that he cares for Barbara and feels really sorry for her at times. And there's this nice back and forth between them throughout this episode where he's trying to kind of get her out of her shell, trying to get her out of this isolation that she's put herself in. But he's also growing impatient. He's not afraid to kind of tell her what it is. Tell her how it is. And on the flip side, she is like, even though Barbara is her own antagonist, you can still root for her and you want her to find peace. She's a belligerent diva when she finds out about the role, and she's obnoxious when she sees her now aged co-star. But the viewer knows she's not exactly at fault, and a lot of that is because of Ida Lupino's performance in this episode. It's so versatile, the way that she can go from just exuding so much happiness just seeing her films on screen, into the hopeful ambition of getting ready to see her co-star or getting ready to go see about a role, and it's kind of this. You can really see how she's trapped herself into this world that she's constructed for herself, where she's still the youthful and sought-after talent, which is what her, I guess, downfall of the episode comes to. Which brings me to that. The ending surprised me, and it kind of made me reconsider my thoughts on Mr. Denton on Doomsday, even. It may have been unfair to fault Doomsday for its lack of Twilight Zone world building. Like I mentioned that the Twilight Zone is about ordinary people in really supernatural and otherworldly kind of environments and stuff. But that's probably unfair, especially this early in the series, because a lot of these episodes are probably like this one and Mr. Denton on Doomsday. Here in the 16-millimeter Shrine, until the final minutes of the episode, it plays out like a drama about an aging actress clinging to the past. Like, there's nothing supernatural about it, and that kind of makes it makes you really, really invested in the characters and the story going on. And when the ending comes and Danny sees present-day Barbara on the screen amidst her adoring co-stars and leading men and everything, it's a shock. It's just an absolute shock. It reminded me of the final image of The Shining. And I kind of wonder if Kubrick drew inspiration from this episode when he adapted Stephen King's novel, because that was 20 years later that movie came out. But it's effective here in the Twilight Zone. Danny finds the scarf that Barbara discards when he screams for her to come back and everything. He finds it at the bottom of the staircase, and it kind of reminded me of the bit of trivia from Where Is Everybody, and how Earl Holliman wanted Mike to bring a page of the phone book back with him. Kind of wonder if that was the reason that they put that in there, or if it was just an independent thing that was just kind of bouncing around in Serling's head when he wrote the episode. But all in all, the 16-millimeter Shrine is a really, really good episode. It's a really solid episode. I noticed on IMDb in the episode rating, and granted, I don't know how accurate this is to gauging viewer reception for this episode or anything like that, and I haven't looked up the Nielsen ratings of the time or anything like that, but it's only rated a 6.9, and I think that's a disservice to it, because it's a very strong episode. It's a very depressing episode, but strong in its own right. So I have a couple points I have a point about the historical and cultural context of this episode. Somewhat, it's more cultural context. It's not really context. It's just a reflection of the time of the era and the time we're in now. But there's a timelessness to the idea of the aging movie star. Barbara is an actress who clings to her past as a leading lady, when the only roles she can manage are supporting roles as a mother to whoever the new starlet is. It's at the time, it was reflective of the troubles that led Ida Lupino to turn to directing and producing and all that. But it's interesting to note that it's a problem with Hollywood in general. At the time of this recording, and I'm dating the podcast, but it's the weekend of Comic-Con, and Jennifer Lawrence and her Hunger Games co-star Josh Hutcherson were on a panel at Comic-Con on Friday. This is Sunday that I'm recording this, for Mockingjay Part 2. And I believe Hutcherson joked that Lawrence is 24 and might as well be 40 in Hollywood's eyes, and Jennifer Lawrence kind of laughed and agreed and said, yeah, really. And I think that's a really... It's it's a trait of Hollywood, and I don't think that it will ever change. It's just the industry seeks young talent and kind of bleeds them until they're deemed too old, and then they move on to the next one. It's just the way that the Hollywood system works, and I think that this episode of the Twilight Zone is a nice, not necessarily deconstruction of that, or maybe it is a deconstruction of that, but a nice shot at it, I guess. And finally, before I go, I have a couple pieces of trivia for this episode. First, the staircase set in this episode that in the I guess foyer set. It'll be reused in 3 other episodes in this season of the Twilight Zone, and I'm really excited about that because it is a gorgeous set, absolutely gorgeous. And then also, while doing research for this episode, I looked up on IMDb and I looked at the trivia section for the episode, and one of the trivia pieces talks about how the name Trenton rhymes with Denton, and this episode was aired right after the Mr. Denton on Doomsday episode. And I was just like, okay, I guess that's trivia. It's very trivial, but it's there. So yeah. Well, there you have it. We have our 2 episodes for this week's anthology podcast presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. Both episodes kind of have an interesting correlation in that their protagonists are kind of down on their luck and seeking a second chance, and both episodes conclude in somewhat upbeat fashion. Denton injured himself and injured a gunfighter to where neither of them will hold a gun again, and that's good for them. And then also Barbara Trenton, I guess it's a happy ending for her. It's a little ambiguous. It's open to interpretation. There's a smile on Danny's face at the end where he tells her that he kind of says to no one that 2 wishes, Barbara, wishes that come true. And she got her wish. She receded back into the past the way that she wanted to. But it's a little bit of a downer ending because she didn't really come to terms with the truth or anything like that. So anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of Anthology. Next episode is going to cover the episodes of the Twilight Zone entitled Walking Distance and Escape Clause. Both are very good episodes. One I'm going to have a lot to say because it's got a nice time travel element to it, and I love time travel. So once again, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find past episodes of the show at anthologypod.com, and please subscribe on iTunes and leave a rating and review. It helps the show out more than you might think. Of course, I crave feedback or conversation of any kind from the audience, so please email your thoughts and feelings about the show to matt@obsessiveviewer.com, or you can tweet me at ObsessiveViewer, and make sure you like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod. Of course, you can also leave me a voicemail at 317-762-6099 for a chance to have it played on the show. If you like what you've heard here, I urge you to check out The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast I host with my friends Tiny and Mike. Also check out the Obsessive Viewer blog at obsessiveviewer.com, where I write movie reviews, TV reviews, and the occasional editorial about the business of entertainment. You can find all of that at obsessiveviewer.com. If you want even more obsessive content in your life, subscribe to the Obsessive Viewer subreddit at r/obsessiveviewer, and check out obsessivebooknerd.com for book reviews, author spotlights, and a general celebration of reading. Finally, if you're philosophically curious, check out my friend Tiny's side project podcast, The Secular Perspective, which explores the concepts of faith, religion, and existence from the perspective of secular hosts. You can find that at thesecularperspective.com. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Join the Obsessive Viewer podcast on October 16th, 2015 at the Irving Theater in Indianapolis for The Obsessive Viewer Presents Shock Shocktober in Irvington Part 2. It's a one-night event screening of short horror films from local artists J.P. Leck and Synapshot Productions. There will be giveaways, raffles, interviews with the filmmakers, and so much more. All proceeds will go directly to the Irvington Historical Society. Go to shocktoberinirvington.com for more details. And prepare to be shocked.